Welcome back again, and it's Focus Africa on Breakfast Xtra. Let's talk about Nepal. In Nepal, a wave of protests led by young people, Gen Z in particular, always shook the foundations of power. These protests, sparked by demands for transparency, accountability, and deeper electoral reform, are not just about politics, they're about reclaiming the future. Nepal's new prime minister rose to office on the back of this discontent. With young voices, or these young voices were demanding a system that listens to them and not just the old political elite. For Africa, this story rings familiar. Across our continent, young people make up the majority, yet too often feel shut out of political and economic decision-making. The Gen Z protest in Nepal highlights the power of youth when they rally around issues of governance, corruption, and accountability. The question is whether Africa's own restless youth population, frustrated by unemployment, also by weak institutions and shrinking civic space, will perhaps see this as sample from Kathmandu. We saw what happened in Kenya from a couple of months ago.
And then the African angle here is critical. If Gen Z in Nepal could force reform through numbers, persistence, and unity, what lessons are there for African societies where young people face similar disillusionment? To help us make sense of this movement, we're joined by Mwanase Ahmed, human rights defender from Kenya, and Victor Terhemba, programs manager at ReadyToLeadAfrica. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, but I will go directly to Mwanase in Kenya. Mwanase, we see that the Gen Zs in Nepal, they took to the streets for transparency, reform, accountability. You know, the force was all out there on the street. From your experience in East Africa, do you see parallels in the frustrations of African youths today?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. I think a lot of our countries, although very different, all with their own context and challenges, we face a lot of challenges that the base reason of it is corruption. It's bad governance. And what does that mean for us when it comes to public service delivery, job creation, economic opportunities, the ability to live dignified lives? So I think ultimately this is a widespread problem that is a post-colonial, neo-colonial, it's internal colonization by our own people who have come into power and are too greedy. So I think we're at a tipping point continentally, globally, where the inequalities and the exploitation can no longer be sustained, and people are going to continue rising. Each country has its own context and will have its own experience and pathway to resistance and to the next wave of liberation and freedom and pursuit of change. So I do think there's a lot of parallels across the African continent, although also unique experiences.
Victor, I'm going to come to you, but I wanted to piggyback off of something that Mwanase said. Mwanase, you live in Kenya. You saw what happened with the youth population there and their protests. Now let's compare that to Nepal. Now, Nepal, they got results. Whether you like it or not, the PM resigned and they have a new PM. There was result. Do you think there was result in the Kenya instance? Do you think that there was much change? Do you think that in the African context, whatever African country, that the youth actually drive change at all? And if they don't, why don't they? Why are they incapable of?
Thank you. I think that what happened in Nepal is what we started to see happen in Kenya in terms of, Ruto firing his administration, firing the CSs, and we did see some similarities in terms of some changes in governance. We did not see the same series of events, and we also saw a lot of brutality, a lot more extrajudicial killings, violence. There were murders in Nepal, and that was, I think, triple, quadruple in Kenya. So there are Kenyans who are angry and said, we didn't finish, look at what Nepal did, what have we done? Ultimately, I think, as I said, every country will have its form of resistance and change, and that liberation will look different. But we did see some similarities in terms of, the cabinet secretary all being fired, but then they were brought in with new, just as corrupt, just as incompetent leaders. So did we see results? I definitely think we saw results because we see a large majority of the country being politically, participating politically and ready to bring a ballot revolution rather than a bullet revolution. And we lost so many lives that it was difficult to continue pushing. Now the youth, we're not waiting another 5, another 3, another 10, another 20 years to see the change we want and need to see. That we're not the leaders of tomorrow, we are the change makers of today. So youth are 100% driving change within their countries already, from outside of government, and also for pushing for good governance, for meeting the gaps that poor governance leaves behind, and organizing for the transition of political power. So again, each country will have its own pathway, but Kenya is 100% still organizing for transition of political power. We're just not on the streets asking our oppressors to stop oppressing us, or our murderers to stop murdering us, or thieves to stop stealing so much. We're actually trying to transition them out, uphold them to the rule of law. There are a lot of criminals and gangsters who are sitting in these political seats. So we are organizing to transition political power and hold them accountable still for all of the injustices and their actions.
Thank you, Mwanase. Victor Terhemba, lead at ReadyToLeadAfrica, Programs Manager. Let's take the Nigerian context now. Now, the tool that young people in Nepal had, that the young people in Kenya had, was actually urgency. The vehicle was protest. We also have that here in Nigeria. Young people want change now. However, in Nigeria, we see a situation where they go on protests and the protests end and not much changes. Where is that gap? What's happening here? What is the Nigerian situation lacking?
So, thank you very much. And then good morning, everyone. So, for every time when we talk about protests and then we're also talking about results, you know, like in recent history, we always like to refer back to NSAS. And when you look at NSAS protests, NSAS was actually largely successful, in my opinion. And I think that in the opinion of why the protest in the first place was organized, it was successful. It was to say, let us end police brutality at the beginning. And what you can see, although the police brutality continued, but no longer at that rate, at that level, at that pernicious level that it was before this intimidation and after the this protest. So we are organized in that way. And it also looked like sometimes it's only one issue. Everybody, all the young people have a particular grievance, like desires for good governance, for more accessible facilities, for more living conditions, better economic opportunities, and all of that. But however, what always happens is that the youth get to rally around one particular issue. And then from that issue, we now escalate to now express all of our grievances around the issues of corruption, around the issues of nepotism, and the rest. So when you look at Kenya, for instance, the reject finance bill started off as, let us reject that financial bill to start with, and then you see later that it snowballed into a larger demand for a larger and wider reform. Same thing happened in Nepal, same thing we witnessed in Nigeria, in NSAS, and also in this kind of bad governance this in protest. And so, but what happened where we sometimes people not think that we are not achieving results, or the results were not achieved at a scale, is because maybe it was not at the scale where we want, but we are coming to understand that the kind of change that mostly we want is going to be evolutionary and not a kind of evolutionary. And that is why this man talked about saying now young people are working with the stakeholders to transition power. So it is no longer like on the streets where we are fighting and demanding. So now we are, sitting at the policy table, designing policies that favor young people, designing how more young people become included, become more inclusive, participate within the process, and also design what their future looks like. So that is the stage where this currently we are. And then I think that I've given a general kind of overview around the recent potential for Nigeria as well.
Right. So with your view, we also know that we have a lot of young populations in Africa. Most of the youngest population is from Africa. But our leaders remain old guard, very, very old guard.
I get you.
So my point is, you think we will need another protest to be able to turn this around? And how much of a time bomb is this disconnect between the leaders that we have and the citizens? Victor, please.
So, so there is no disconnect per se. I think that even the older people are not listening, realizing. So the main issue is not about whether we have older people there. It's about the conditions that young people find themselves if they are able to pursue their ambitions and their kind of aspiration as they deem fit. So when you even look at Nepal case, for instance, you know, after the release of my prime minister resigned, the Gen Zs are now working with the chief of army staff to form a new government. And the person that they have also proposed that should be the head of the interim government is a 70-something years old former chief justice. So usually, because they are young people, but then they believe in a leadership that it will bring about success. So usually it's not about how, and then for every time you see protests that happen, from the NSAS protest, from this in Kenya protest, and now this Nepal protest, in Nigeria, leaders, the government are very wary. They know that there is a sitting time bomb between what they do now to, you know, fulfill the aspiration of young people and how the young people might get to this react. And that is why every time there is like an inkling of saying maybe the young people want to organize and come up for this protest, you see how the government begins to panic, begins to issue statement upon statement, begins to also issue amongst the young people. You know, I don't know. So it's like they understand the different potentials of and this is what is going to be there. And it's actually good that they know that the youth have the capacity to mobilize in numbers, come out, and then demand for their resignation until they basically leave. But like I said earlier, we are beginning to understand that the best way to cause change is within the democratic institutions, which we are now currently engaging largely across Africa generally.
Okay, so Victor, let me interject real quick. You mentioned that there was no disconnect between our leaders and the citizens, and then you mentioned that the new prime minister in Nepal is 73 years old. That is Sushili Kaki. Now, it took them about 4 to 5 days protests with the burning of the parliament to be able to get what they asked for. In Nigeria or in Africa, well, let me say Nigeria because we're in Nigeria, we see that it takes weeks, months. We've seen either from the seafarers to the doctors to get results, and then they come up with a community. So explain to me when you say there's no disconnect between the leaders and the citizens, using that as a reference.
Okay. So when I mean that there is no disconnect, I mean I don't mean it in the in terms of governance service delivery. I mean it in the sense that if we both have the understanding that, you know, something drastic can be done when the youth mobilize, and which is why I gave the instance that it's why the government begins to threat anytime.
Oh, it seems
and the young people to a sign that they want to actually mobilize.
All right, Victor, thank you very much. Mwanase, we didn't forget you. Let's come back to you. Now, Mwanase, when we take a look at protests across Africa recently, and especially in Nepal, what happened in Kathmandu, very unique. Social media was a very big part of it. Social media was actually the matches that set the fire when they were what's the word, banned by decree, like, you know, ban these social. That's what sparked the fire. In Africa, we see social media used as a tool during protests. We've also heard of arguments that social media is cut off when there are protests from specific areas just so that, you know, there's communication issues. But the biggest deal here in the Nepal issue was that social media also was a big apparatus used to put in place the new PM. Many say she was not elected, she was selected. And they did this on an app where people were able to, in quote, vote and say, we would like Sushila Kaki as the interim PM. And it seemed to work. Now, how can we plug into that in our electoral system here in Africa? How can we begin to involve the young people, because social media is where they live, eat, and sleep every day? How can we make these processes how can we involve these processes into our systems?
Thank you. I just briefly comment that I think there's a huge disconnect between the leadership and the needs of the youth and the needs of the citizenry. And if there wasn't, regardless of the age, the leadership would be serving the needs of the people, and there wouldn't be such challenges in existence in livelihoods, and there wouldn't be these mass uprisings and kind of tipping points. So just a brief comment there as I transition to your question.
Okay.
Social media is extremely important at the moment to be able to expose injustice, to share thoughts, to organize people, for our countries to also see what's happening in other places, to inspire each other. As you mentioned, there is a lot of censorship that's happening in Kenya as well. Last year, during one of what we called like the Githurai pipeline massacre, which was one evening after the protests, when the police went into a pretty marginalized community, and it was basically a mass massacre where we will never know the results of what happened then, because there was a blackout, a network blackout simultaneous to that. So censorship is dangerous. I think the government tries to use it in their benefit, because they would like people to stop using social media to spread truth, to share the truth, to showcase the realities. And technology in itself is extremely powerful. So we are seeing youth in Kenya as well already trying to use technology to allow for participation in, for public participation in government processes. For example, there was a young set up a website that would allow people a recent finance bill. I believe it was either finance or data protection. And the government actually came for her in her house, abducted her, imprisoned her, and locked her up because she had started this portal which would allow people to directly engage in giving feedback on bills, which is a function that is meant to be within government and within good governance. So technology could completely be a game changer in enabling participation in governance, in voting, in having independent data compilation where people can participate in the electoral processes or government processes. But the government is afraid of that because they have less control over it. So if we retain the ballot where you have to go and stay in line and they can block you from participating and they can burn ballot boxes and miscount, and it allows for predetermined outcomes or influenced outcomes. So technology will continue to be an extremely important part of electoral processes, dissemination of information and organizing.
All right, then, Mwanase.
And we are sure they'll continue to fight back against
Sorry, I have to break in there, Mwanase. We are out of time. I have one last question for Victor. Victor, you are aware of the situations in Nigeria. Young people seem very disenfranchised. In fact, they don't seem like a system, like a part of the system. How can we involve them, noting that social media is a big part of their lives? And I mean now in the electoral process itself. Do you think the reforms we're looking for inside of the electoral process should involve the use of social media in electing public officers?
Well, I think that would be an interesting something to actually look at and also consider. And I also say this because we are transitioning from generations to like another generations. And if you take a cue from like Nepal, so the protest happened because of social media ban. And the government thought that asking social media to register and then regulate them would bring sanity. But then they don't understand that young people are people that are now formed with different kind of orientation. They have different issues. They are in a different culture. They have different ideologies now. So if as much as we have embraced, and I think this is also a conversation that would be interesting to have to see how we integrate technology completely. We've seen suggestions from young people that why can't we just vote from this comfort of their homes? Why do they have to expose themselves outside to this political violence? Why do they have to stress themselves outside? And you know, so there's a talk about kind of electorate voting, and then there's also about tech voting, virtual voting using blockchain and all of this. So these are conversations that would be interesting to consider to see how we embrace young people, because in the long run, nothing stays static. Society is always evolve. And so once you have got to generation where we are mostly social media inclined, then we can start exploring this to see how we can integrate this technology into our system.
Right. Thank you so much, Victor Terhemba and Mwanase Ahmed, for joining us and giving us insight as to the situation in